In this video, I'm going to show you how to implement server-side rendering in your ReactJs app that you have built using Vite. So all that hype around NextJs that you see, which is obviously a Vercel's marketing gimmick to use NextJs, which all it says is it uses ReactJs, but it also provides server-side rendering support. Now I'm going to show you how to implement server-side rendering in your ReactJs app so that you pretty much would never even have to use NextJs. Now, obviously NextJs, because it's been built by Vercel for so long, they have a lot of additional features, but you should know how server-side rendering actually works behind the scenes and how your website actually gets the pre-rendered HTML from the server to the client. So let's say if you work in a company which has already implemented their website using ReactJs especially and not NextJs, and you need SSR support in it now, so it could get pretty hectic if you had to revamp your entire ReactJs app to a NextJs application. Instead, you could learn how to convert your ReactJs application to a server-sided ReactJs application. So in this video, I'm going to show you exactly how to do that and how simple it is to implement something like server-side rendering. So first of all, what I'm going to do is I'm going to set up a basic React project using Vite. So I'm going to open my terminal, and right over here, let me just zoom in a bit. So right over here, I am going to write npm create vite @latest, and then I'll just write something like ssr react vite, and then I'll press enter. Alright, so now it's going to give me some options to select a particular framework. I'm going to select React, and then I'm just going to select the plain JavaScript one. So the reason I'm going to select the plain JavaScript version is because I want to show you a starting point where I get just a plain client-side ReactJs application and how I'm going to just make a few changes to it and make it SSR friendly. So now that I've created that project, it is asking me to cd into that directory. So I'll do just that. I'll cd into that. Then I will do an npm install to just install all the packages. Then once the npm install is complete, I will copy and paste the npm run dev. And this will do nothing but it will just spin up a server in the localhost 5173 port number. So I'll copy and paste this right over here. And you see, we have our simple setup for our ReactJs project, which is at the moment client side, and it is built using Vite. So let me just open the code editor up. So in the command line itself, I will write code space dot. This will open up the code editor. And I'll go to nothing but the app.jsx. Alright, so let me just resize it. So right over here, we have our basic React app setup. So now, one way to understand if your project or your application is being server-side rendered or not is if I actually right click on this and I click on the view page source. Now if you notice in the view page source, in the div ID of root, I have nothing inside this. So basically, I'm displaying all these logos and texts, but within this div ID of root, I have nothing displayed. This means when I first hit this application, when I reload this, sorry, I just closed my server, so I'll restart it. Alright, so when I actually reload this, what happens is the server sends this empty HTML file to the client. Alright, so the server gets this empty HTML file to the client, where no text or no logo is going to be rendered. Then the client injects JavaScript to this HTML file, because you can see in this empty HTML file, we have a script being called, which is nothing but the main.jsx. And if I go to the main.jsx, this calls nothing but the app, and the app is where our code is being rendered. Alright, the app is where all of this is being rendered. So when we go to localhost 5173, the server sends this empty HTML. So the user first gets an empty white page, and then this script is called, which calls the main.jsx, which does nothing but it tries to get the root ID, which is nothing but this part over here, the root ID, and then it injects the app.jsx into the root ID. So if you go to the main.jsx, you see it uses .render, and then it puts the app component in there. So all of this is happening in the client side. The server just gives us this empty index.html with this empty div ID of root. Then once the client has received this empty index.html file, the client calls the main.jsx, and the main.jsx hydrates the application or makes the UI visible by injecting the app component into the React application, which contains the entire code. Alright, so this is what happens in a client-side application. So in a client-side ReactJs project, you never get to see anything over here. But our main goal is to server-side render this application so that the server, when it sends the index.html, it's going to contain the information here already. So we don't have to wait for the client to inject it, but when the server sends this index.html to the client, the information we want to display to the user is already going to be present in this div ID of root. Now, what's the benefit of this? The benefit of this is the user will at least get a preview of the website or the page that they're trying to access as soon as they load the website, because they don't have to wait for the client to inject the code into the website. Rather, the code, the preview of the website will be already there because it will be rendered by the server itself. Alright, so how do we do something like this? Well, first of all, what I'll do is I will actually go to my code and I'll remove a few things over here. We just want to keep this very simple so all of you can understand. I will remove all of this, Vite plus React. I will also remove this div and this fragment as well, and also the use state. Alright, so let's just keep it like a simple text right now. Alright, Vite plus React, that's all. Now again, if I open the page source, you'll see this is still empty because we haven't server-side rendered this. So now let's actually implement the server-side rendering. Now I will keep this file as it is. I'm not going to refresh this because I want you guys to keep this as a reference so that you can see later on the difference between an SSR rendered page source versus a client-side rendered page source. This over here is a client-side rendered page source. Okay. So now let's implement server-side rendering. So the first thing that I need to do is I will right over here in the src, I will create two files. First is the entry client.jsx and let me increase the size of this. Alright, so entry client.jsx and then the entry server.jsx. Alright, so why have I created entry client and entry server? Well, as I said, in the server-side rendering, the HTML is already rendered on the server and then it's sent to the client. So the entry client over here, it is going to hydrate the index.html that is going to be sent by the server. So just know that in SSR, even though I get the page rendered in the server and sent to the client is able to view the page sooner, but the page gets interactive once the client hydrates it. So basically, the server sends the index.html, but it's just a preview of the page. The buttons and all don't work because the JavaScript hasn't been added into it. We just have a plain index.html structure of the preview of the page. So once the index.html is sent from the server to the client, the user is able to see the page, but then to interact with it, the browser injects JavaScript to the server rendered HTML to make it interactive. Alright, and that is what our entry client is going to do. It's going to make sure that once the index.html is received by the server, then it's going to do nothing but it's going to hydrate or make the index.html interactive. So if you have any buttons and all, it will work only after the browser hydrates the server rendered HTML file. And hydrate just means making the application or making the page interactive, basically making the buttons and all clickable. And you will see why I need the entry server soon enough. Don't worry about that now. So what I'll do over here first is I will write import in the entry client.jsx. I'll write import React DOM from nothing but React DOM / client. Alright. And then I will do nothing but I will import the app.jsx over here. So I'll write import app from nothing but /app. After that, I'll do nothing but I'll copy paste the React DOM, and then the React DOM has nothing but a property called hydrate root. So I'll hydrate nothing but document.get element by ID. I'll select nothing but the root. So I'll take the ID of root, basically this part, and within this I'll hydrate the app.jsx. Alright, so root, and then I will do nothing but I'll call the app component. Alright, so once server-side rendering gets implemented completely, we won't require this main.jsx anymore, because previously in the client side, the main.jsx was doing everything on the client. So the server sends an empty HTML, then the client injects the preview as well as the JavaScript. Basically, it injects the HTML as well as it does the hydration. But now this part is being done by the entry client. So the entry client, because it already gets the rendered HTML, it just has to hydrate it. So that's all this is going to do. It's just going to hydrate the app to our index.html. Basically, it's just going to make the content within the div ID of root interactive. Alright, so later on, we won't even need this main.jsx anymore. Alright, then after that, I'll go to the entry server.jsx. So now in the entry server, The reason we need the entry server is because we need to render the HTML in the server, right? So this is going to help us to generate the HTML on the server. So what I mean by this is, don't worry, I'll code along and you'll understand. So what I'll do first is I'll just write import render to string from React DOM/server. And over here as well, I'll import the app. So import app from nothing but app. Alright, so now you might be wondering, what is render to string? Well, if I actually open that in the React docs, you can see render to string is nothing but on the server call render to string to render your app to the HTML. So we have to do something like this. So our main job right now, as you know in server-side rendering, is I want this entire part to be present within this div ID of root. So I want this app.jsx, when it's sent by the server to the client, I want this part to be already be present in this root when I view the page source. So to make that happen in the server, I have to make sure that I take this app.jsx, take the content within the app.jsx, and I inject it within the div ID of root in the server itself, because the server contains this index.html, right? It contains this blank index.html page. So in this, I can inject the app.jsx right in the server itself and then send it to the client. So the client is going to get a preview of the page. And that is exactly what render to string helps us do. It helps us to render React element to its initial HTML. This should only be used in the server, and React will return an HTML string. So the output of what this is going to return, I'm going to use that in the server file that I'm going to create soon enough, because this is still in the client directory, right? The entry server. But the reason I have put this over here is because the Vite doc supports it like that. So if you go over here in the server-side rendering, it says that typical SSR application will have the following: source file structure, entry client, and entry server, all within the SRC. That's why I have created that over here itself. You could also go ahead and write this in the server.js file that I'm soon going to create. Alright, but I'm just going to keep this here, and I'm going to write nothing but export function. I'm going to export a render function that does nothing but it just returns this render to string, which takes in nothing but the app component. Alright, so this render to string is going to help us get an HTML string, which I can inject within this index.html's div ID of root. Alright, because we can't just directly place this right inside this over here. This can have some JSX and all that as well, right? So to convert this function app, export default app into an HTML file, I would have to use nothing but render to string. And then later on, because this contains nothing but the HTML structure, the HTML string structure of this entire part, so later on in the server, I can directly call render, take the response returned from this function and inject it into the index.html in the div ID of root. Alright, you will soon understand this, don't worry. So now after this, the next step is to create our server.js file. Alright, so right over here in the root, I will create nothing but server.js. Now this is our backend express server. Alright, so this is our server, which is going to render the HTML, the index.html, and because the server is in this directory itself, so I can easily get the index.html from here, and in the div ID of root, I can just inject nothing but the HTML string of the app component. Alright, so I'll go to my server.js, and now this part is going to be pretty simple. All I have to do is I can go to the documentation of Vite, and over here, what I can do is just notice one thing first. Over here in the Vite documentation itself, the index.html will need to reference entryclient.js and include a placeholder where the server rendered markup should be injected. So they are saying that over here, I need to add this comment, which I will place right over here, just like that. You will see that why, because this will help us get this template and then inject the render to string HTML right over here. And we need to make sure that the script points to the entry client this time instead of the main.jsx. As I said in the beginning, right, that we do not have to point this anymore to the main.jsx. The main.jsx will become completely redundant. We can just point this to the entry client from now on, because the entry client is going to hydrate the server rendered HTML. So what I can do is I'll actually create this over here and I'll copy this right over here. I'll remove this comment. So you can see the difference between the HTML file for a client-side rendered versus a server-side rendered ReactJs application. Alright, so this is just one simple change we have to make. We are making sure the script is pointing to the entry client, and this has a comment inside it. Now the next part is, if I scroll down, you can see it's setting up the dev server. So basically the server.js file I created, what I can do is, they have written over here, when building an SSR app, you likely want to have full control over your main server and decouple Vite from the production environment. It is therefore recommended to use Vite in middleware mode. Here is an example with Express v4. So they have done nothing but they have created their server using Express, and over here we will be rendering the HTML before sending it to the client. So if I go down here, I scroll down, you can see first what I can do is, so over here what I'll do is I'll copy this entirely and I'll literally paste it in my server.js, just like that. Alright, now it's looking for dir name and fs. Now to get that, what I'll do is I will copy this part, which is nothing but this contains the code for the app.use. So this route, I'll come here and then I'll copy this part and I'll paste this here. Alright, now with that done, that is literally all we need for the server.js. Now if I just had to explain you what's happening over here, it's pretty simple. They have mentioned everything very properly. So these are some of Vite's requirements in the server.js file. So create Vite server in middleware mode and configure the type as custom, disabling Vite's own HTML serving logic so parent server can take control. So once you deploy to the production and all that, you'll want that you have control over your application the way it works, not how the Vite server controls it. So to make sure that you have your own control, you can put this configuration that's going to make sure in the production environment, when you deploy this app to production, you can have more control over how you want things to operate. So then over here, this is just using Vite middlewares. This is just syntactical sugar that Vite requires. If I go over here, you can see the entire reason, the entire purpose of this first part, I'm not talking about the app.use, but just all of this custom setup done by Vite is, you'll likely want to have full control over your main server and decouple Vite from the production environment. It is therefore recommended to use Vite in middleware mode. So in the production, these things won't hamper your code. Alright, so you don't have to worry too much about all this. This is just Vite's configuration. If you were, let's say, not using Vite, then you wouldn't even have to add all these parts over here. Our main focus is with this part, the app.use star. So now, if you worked with Express, you know that if you use app.use and you create this star over here, and then this port is running nowhere but 5173. So when you open localhost 5173, this server is going to spin up. And when this server spins up, it's going to first go to its root URL. And when you do localhost 5173, the root is going to be nothing but the star, whatever that's specified in the star. So whatever that's specified in the star, if you're returning anything from the response within this app.use, that is going to be displayed in the localhost 5173, because localhost 5173 is going to invoke this part over here, which is doing nothing but it's returning a response, which is nothing but our pre-rendered HTML on the server. So this line over here, all it's doing is, as it's written over here, it's reading the index.html. So the index.html that we have over here, all of this, we could either remove this entire file and copy and paste this over here, or we could just directly read it from the already existing index.html file we have, which is a better thing. Why to remove this file and copy and paste it here, convert it into a string, and then inject our app component to it. Instead, this line, it's accessing the file system and it's going to the directory which contains nothing but the index.html. So the template is nothing but it contains the index.html. Alright, then after that, we apply Vite HTML transforms. This injects the Vite HTML client and also applies HTML transforms from Vite plugins, global preambles from ReactJs plugin React. So these are again just Vite syntactical sugars. This adds nothing but the hot module replacement, which is whenever you update the code and save, it refreshes instantly. So it takes all that from Vite and it adds it to our template. That's all this does, which is not necessary. It's necessary during development though. Then after that comes our important part where I am calling nothing but the entry server.js. If you remember over here, I was exporting the render function that does nothing but it takes the code within the app.jsx, and it converts it into a readable HTML string. So this function returns nothing but a readable HTML string of the app component. So this line over here, it calls vite.ssr load module. It points to the entry server.js, and within the entry server.js, we are returning the render function. So that is what we are getting over here. Then we use this render right over here. So we create a variable named app.html. Here we just use await and we call the render over here, which is nothing but this function with this URL, which is pretty much not required because we are not actually accepting anything within this render over here. We just have this much. So over here, this line, all it's going to do is it's going to store the HTML string version of the app.jsx within the app.html variable. Because as I said, again, render is extracted from the entry server, which calls render to string. That does nothing but it returns an HTML string view of our app component. All right. So our app.html variable consists the HTML string view of our app component. So that means in the app.html variable, we have our entire app.jsx in an HTML format. So now all we need to do is we just need to inject this to the div element of root, or basically to this part over here, wherever the SSR outlet comment has been put. All right. So now the reason of putting this over here, you'll see that soon. So here I just need to inject this to the root div. So all I'm doing over here is I'm injecting the app rendered HTML into the template. The template over here contains nothing but the entire index.html. So I am injecting the HTML string version of the app component to the SSR outlet part. Basically, I'm saying in the template, in the index.html, replace this string over here. Basically, replace this part over here with the variable app.html. So that SSR outlet will be replaced with app.html. And this contains the rendered HTML string version of our app component. Then lastly, we are just sending this HTML to the client, basically to the browser. So now what happens is, if I actually go to this URL, which is nothing but localhost 5173, I should be getting nothing but this part, Vite plus React, but it should be pre-rendered on the server. Now to do that, we need to do just one last thing, which is a Vite configuration. So we need to go to the Vite config.js. Then over here, all I need to do is I'll write build, and here I will write SSR true. This should be SSR true, meaning that we are telling Vite that please enable the server-side rendering mode. All right. Now one last thing I need to do is, if I go to the package.json over here, I usually write npm run dev, right, to start the React application. But npm run dev basically starts the client side of the application. We don't want to do that anymore. We want to make sure that we start the server. So when we do npm run dev, I want to start the server, because the server is what's going to render the HTML and send it to the client. And the server is nothing but the root, the home page, or the root route now. Basically localhost 5173. That is nothing but present in the server. So over here, I'm going to remove Vite and I'm going to write node server. All right. It's the same as opening the terminal and writing node server.js and spinning up the server.js. All right. So now that I've written node server, what I can do is I can test it. But first of all, if you check this one thing, before I pasted this entire code, I did not actually install Express. So what I'll do is I will actually go over here and I will write npm I express. All right, now with that done, I'll clear this out and now I'll write npm run dev. And you can see when I write npm run dev, it spins up our node server. So now I can actually go to 5173. If I press enter, it still says cannot find entry point module entry server.js. Well, I know why that is, because if I open my code, you can see it calls this part over here, and here it's trying to load the entry server.js module, but we have specified the wrong extension here. This should be JSX, because this is JSX. And because I just updated this, one more thing I remember, we can also update this. We're trying to access entry client.js over here. This should be entry client.jsx as well. This is going to help us hydrate our React app. So now with that done, if I just restart my server, because I don't have nodemon installed, so I have to use, every time I make a code change, I have to manually restart the server. So npm run dev. Now if I refresh this, there you go. You see, I get Vite plus React. And remember one thing, I had saved this page source, right? This was for the client side application. In the client side, if I viewed the page source, I used to get nothing in the dev ID of root. However, now in this server rendered React application, if I open the page source, you will notice I get Vite plus React with the h1 tag present in the dev ID of root itself right from the beginning. That means this was rendered on the server and then it was sent to the client. So you see, so this is the difference between a server-side React.js project versus a client-side React.js project. Now, obviously, this is going to help a lot during SEO because you can add a lot of meta tags, a lot of information for the page you're trying to access right over here, which is going to make sure that when Google web crawlers try to crawl your link, they're going to find all of that information regarding your website very easily. And that's going to help you rank your website better. So this is pretty much how you server-side render a React application. Wasn't that cool? Super simple and easy. I could have completed this video very quickly, but just to explain you everything, this video took a little bit of time. But if you actually follow the steps in this video, it's hardly a 5 to 10 minute process. Okay, so now the SSR part is complete, but there is still one more thing remaining. If you remember at the beginning of the video, there was also a background color and this was present at the center instead over here at the top. So that means our entire CSS hasn't been applied. Well, that's because if I open up the code, so if you remember, I had told once SSR is done, we do not need this main.jsx anymore because in the index.html, we are using the entry client.jsx script. So because of that, if I actually, let's say, open the network tab over here and I refresh, so you can see I get the app.css. But however, I do not get the index.css. This part over here. So I'm getting the app.css because in the app.jsx, I'm importing the app.css. However, I'm not getting the index.css because index.css is being imported in the main.jsx file. And this is something we're not using anymore. So all I need to do is I need to copy this and I need to instead put this over here in the entry client.jsx because this is nothing but our new main.jsx, or basically this file is where we hydrate our elements. So this is where we need the index.css instead of having in our main.jsx. So now if I actually open the browser, you can see we have the exact code as we had at the beginning of the video with all these styles applied appropriately. So if I go to the bottom, you can also see I have index.css and app.css coming through. That means our SSR now works perfectly fine in the page source as well. You can see we have Vite plus React in the HTML itself. So that is how you implement SSR in your custom React.js application. So with that, that's all for the video. If you found it insightful, drop a like and subscribe for more.